There's a new podcast from the TED Audio Collective I'd love to tell you about. It's called Body Stuff with Dr. Jen Gunter. Body Stuff reveals the lies we're told and sold about our health by exploring how the body actually works and some of the surprising backstories behind the health advice we're given. I mean, is it actually possible to boost your immune system? Do we really need 8 glasses of water a day? Find and follow Body Stuff with Dr. Jen Gunter wherever you're listening to this. Hello there, I'm Chris Anderson. Welcome to the TED interview and another episode where we try to make sense of this pivotal moment. This virus is a common enemy striking the whole world. And in this episode, we deliberately take a global lens. My guest is the journalist and author Fareed Zakaria, who you might know from his show on CNN. I've always been struck by how broad his knowledge is of the global story, putting together all the pieces from what's happening around the world. And so our conversation includes a comparison of different countries' responses to this virus, and especially this dilemma that so many countries face about to what extent you shut down hard and then risk economic catastrophe. It was recorded live on Facebook as part of a daily series we've been doing. And so you'll hear our current affairs editor, Whitney Pennington-Rogers, chip in from time to time with questions from our online audience. As always, in order to publish it quickly, this conversation has not been edited. After this episode, we're taking a 2-week break with our daily series to begin releasing the episodes we were working on before the world changed. But as we think about the future of this show, we've got a key decision to make. Namely, should we keep posting these daily conversations that are primarily about the coronavirus and all of the implications associated with it? Or did you prefer the old version of slightly more polished, better edited podcasts about a broad array of other topics? Are you sick of the coronavirus? Give us feedback, please. You can write to us on podcasts@ted.com. We'll read every piece of input and really appreciate your engagement on that. Okay, then, let's dive in. Here's Fareed Zakaria.
Pleasure to be here, Chris.
Fareed, let's start by getting a sense from you of how you think of this thing that's happening now. You've covered so many disasters over the years. How do you rate and think of this one?
Well, I think this is more dramatic, more global, and more unusual than anything we have seen in a long, long time. Because first you have the healthcare crisis, a pandemic that is spread across the world and with unknown lethality and unknown consequences. And that is raging as we speak through the world. But then has come an economic reality which has become more and more acute, which we were just hearing about. I think it's not right to call this a recession or even to talk about a Great Depression. This is sort of a great paralysis because for the first time that I can think of in recorded human history, you have had a literal standstill of the major economies of the world, large parts of the major economies of the world, which have literally just stopped functioning. The basic principle of economic exchange is not happening because human beings are not in proximity with one another and therefore cannot engage in that. So you are seeing a simple paralysis of that, which is much deeper, I think, at least in the short term, than even the Great Depression. Then you get the result of what this does in poor countries, because so far we have just talked about what is happening in rich countries. And now you get to the Indias of the world. And there you have the problems I described, except these countries are cash poor, budget strained in budget terms, have poor healthcare systems, and have a lot of overcrowding. I mean, think about the slums of a place like Mumbai or Calcutta or Nairobi. And then you add to this the geopolitics that is going to come to play as everybody draws in, as everybody becomes more nationalist. The most powerful expression of that is, of course, the European Union, which has been the celebration in the pooling of sovereignty. And what has happened in Europe is almost all the countries in the so-called visa-free zone, the passport-free zone, the Schengen area, have reimposed borders for the first time in decades. And when Italy asked the European Union, with fellow European members, for help, the 26 other countries to send them medical supplies and things, not one said yes.
Do you have any picture in your mind about how you think this will play out? I mean, if it's a unique situation, a lot of people are hoping that it's a relatively short economic shock. We defeat the virus. We somehow manage a careful return to work, and life returns to normal. Is that fantasy thinking?
I don't think it's fantasy thinking. A lot depends on how short the shock is, and I do think there's some hopeful signs that we're seeing. We can get into that. The data has been very, very interesting and is changing fast. If it's short, I think you could see a return to some degree of normalcy. But I think it'll be very hard to just restart the economy because, what you realize is that modern economies are like riding a bicycle on steroids. You know, the old line about riding a bicycle, you have to keep moving forward. When you stop, it's not like you can just pick up where you were. Think about a restaurant. Your credit lines have collapsed. Your workers, in many cases, have lost their livelihood, may have gone back to the place they came from, may have found another job out of desperation. Public's attitudes will not be exactly the same, particularly for close contact businesses like restaurants. And so, because you've had a disruption of supply and demand at the same time, it's not going to be that easy to restart. And that is why the government is correctly getting very involved. And I have to say, on this front, the American government seems to be doing more than most other governments. There are a lot of areas where you can say the American government has performed abysmally. But on the economic front, with all the partisanship in Washington, it is actually properly, and the Federal Reserve as a part of that, is properly reacting to the kind of historic nature of this. So I think if it's a short shock, we might get back to some degree of normal, though there will be industries like travel and restaurants and theaters, maybe sports, that will have a much longer time frame. If we get a vaccine, when we get a vaccine, I tend to, on that front, be a little bit more historically minded by this. If the Spanish flu that killed multiple times as many people in percentage terms as this one will likely, if that didn't kill restaurants and theaters and sports, I'm not sure this will. I think the people are painting a picture of a world where there will never be restaurants and there will never be movie theaters and there will never be, gatherings of any kind. I don't know. Human beings like to be in contact with one another.
Well, I'm sure that the last pandemic in the Spanish flu killed many businesses, and eventually they came back in different. So it's almost hard to separate. I mean, what's clear is there's going to be just massive amounts of tragedy, massive numbers of people who may have seen their life savings evaporate, if they even ever had any, or maybe struggling on the breadline right now. And yes, some kind of life will be come back. Let's talk.
Let me just say one thing about what you said, Chris, because it's so important. I think so many of the people who we deal with live in a digital economy in which they can work from home. Their jobs, in large part, can continue in some way or the other. Okay, maybe you lose some business, but there is a much greater degree of stability. But for the vast majority of people who are losing their jobs, they're losing their jobs because their work can't be digitized. And I think it's important to recognize this is creating its own kind of new inequality, an equality between the digital economy and the material economy, between knowledge workers and non-knowledge workers, which maps on rather, tragically in similar ways to the old inequalities. In which people who were knowledge workers did well and people who were working with their hands did not.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's, the only piece of hope I can see from that is that so many people have developed this newfound appreciation for the amazingness of the work of people they didn't spend enough time thinking about. You see, people talking with great gratitude about the delivery man or the woman who for their once a week visit to the grocery store, if they could manage that, and so forth. And these people are heroes as our workers on the front line. The question is almost like, is there any chance, do you see any chance that kind of attitude will survive this, that we'll hold on to that and somehow reframe the priorities in our economy, the people who we think should be compensated more perhaps, and just how we all think of each other as much more interconnected than we know? Or do we just forget about this after a month of things kind of going back to normal?
I hope we do. And I think some of that depends on people like you and me, who do have a role in shaping public dialogue and public memory, not to make sure that it doesn't get forgotten, and that we do remember that, we're all in this together. I often think about that when you're dealing with people in countries like the United States who are poor, who don't vote, who don't write op-eds. How do you make sure that perspective and that voice is remembered? Unfortunately, the structural reality is that the digital economy will do even better out of this recovery, because people will learn that they can buy groceries online when they might have not wanted to do that beforehand, and the little mom and pop store on the street corner might lose more business as a result of it. So it's all the more reason to try to remind people that we're all in this together.
So right now, every country on the planet has this horrible dilemma as to how aggressively you shut things down, and then how, if at all, how to bring things back. Give us your sense, Fareed, on which countries have done a good job of managing that dilemma, and which really haven't so far.
I think it's actually pretty easy to tell right now. The data is, we have enough information that we can say that quite definitively. Obviously there may be second waves and third waves, but so far, it is not the case that dictatorships have done this better than democracies. That is not the dividing line. The dividing line is places that have effective government, that have depended on experts and acted early. So that the key countries that have done well have been the ones in East Asia. And that's China, which actually comes across in many ways worse than some of the others, but because it was a very slow start, it hid the data, it lied about it. But then when it finally realized it was serious, they handled it very well. But the countries that really come across well are Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong. And what they did, and South Korea is really probably the model country, is they acted very early. They developed their own tests the minute the DNA sequence was published. And then they went out and did mass testing and contact tracing, because the most important thing you need to understand is how many people have this disease, so that you can understand what parts of the economy, whom to isolate, whom not to isolate, things like that. So, because without that, you're really flying blind. And what South Korea was able to do was really do the most sophisticated kind of testing, which is random sampling. So, because what we're doing, just think about how we are arriving at something like our fatality rate, how many people die. We only know the people who test for COVID on the basis of people who fall sick, are sick enough that they go to a hospital or a clinic, and the hospital or clinic says, okay, your symptoms are close enough to what we think COVID is, and we'll test you for it. And those are the people we test. South Korea, which of course means there are lots of people. We now know lots of people who have mild symptoms, who get over it, who think it's a cold. All those people don't get counted. The South Koreans did all of that. They have achieved in some ways, the most impressive results in the world without a national lockdown, without shelter in place, without quarantines. They have occasionally selectively done it for specific, with the bars in one area or things like that. But that's really, I think the world should look at that example, because they have achieved it without shutting down the economy.
It's almost like the watchword for a future pandemic is, can you avoid it getting out of control? And only a few countries have done that, when you can still be in this containment mode of basically being able to track every known case. That is completely different from the mode of it's out of control. We can't possibly track down everyone. So we just have to shut everything down. And that's when the massive economic damage and so forth kicks in.
Yeah, it almost in some ways this crisis plays to America's weaknesses rather than to its strengths. The United States has many strengths, but it is a chaotic, disorganized, messy, noisy country, right? And it's slow to stir to action, but once it stirs to action, over time it accomplishes a lot. This is Churchill's famous line about the United States is you can count on the United States to do the right thing after it has exhausted every other alternative. So what this, unfortunately, for exactly the reason you say, this is a crisis where early action helps enormously, because of the nature of exponential growth. If you catch it early, it makes a big difference. Unfortunately, the United States did not do that.
Are there any countries in Europe? I mean, many countries in Europe also kind of botched what happened, certainly when you compare with what happened in some Asian countries. Are there any that impressed you?
Yes, Germany is actually close to South Korea in how well it has handled it. Started a little bit later, has put in place stay at home policies and social distancing, partly because I think it got a slightly slower start. Denmark has done very well as doing random testing, and as a result, you're seeing the Danes are beginning to open up the economy. I think that Iceland is doing well again, trying to do the test. What you notice about all these places where the government is respected, it's well funded, the bureaucracies get good people. Those people are able to exercise a lot of power and discretion.
Whitney.
So we're seeing a lot of questions online, Haider Fareed, about the negative impacts on the economy and our lifestyle, which are things that we've been hearing often. But can you speak to some of the positive things you see coming out of this as it relates to work opportunities, our economy, the lifestyle, the way that we have been doing things? What do you see as positive outcomes of this disruption?
Well, let's not minimize the negative, because I think there are probably a lot of people there who are feeling pain and who are experiencing massive dislocations in their lives. And I think it's important to recognize that. It's important for the government to help to treat this as a kind of disaster relief program, not as a traditional stimulus. This is a case where, frankly, the government forced these businesses for understandable reasons, but forced these businesses not to operate or force these people not to go to work. And it is incumbent on the government to provide assistance. Now, what are the opportunities? Unfortunately, they're mostly in the digital realm, right? I mean, you're going to see a lot. People are finding ways to be able to do things digitally that they didn't, where they were previously doing it in other ways. Meetings, everything can be done. You're going to find ways to be more productive than you had to do. Look, I mean, one piece of this I think about is maybe we all travel too much. Maybe there are ways to do a lot of meetings without having to do so many of us travel a lot. It's probably bad for the environment. It's not great for your family life. And so maybe there is a kind of an ability to step back and say, that we could have a different kind of life. We could achieve a certain amount in other ways, but I do want to stress, this is very tough on a lot of people, and unfortunately, I think the part we are going to find more difficult than people are imagining is that restart button. You're not going to just push a button and get the economy going again.
Fareed, do you think that the Indian government got it right in what they did? Because the dilemma for them is different from elsewhere. You've got the virus coming, but you also have your economy is powered by people who make no money, and as we heard earlier, the potential hardship that some of them face. Is this a case where the cure literally might be worse than the disease?
It's a very tough question, and it's a very tough challenge. I would have hated to have been in Prime Minister Modi's shoes. Clearly, what was animating that decision was this. India was at an early enough stage that if you acted quickly, again, because of this exponential growth, you could achieve something significant. And most importantly, India has one of the lowest beds per capita in the world. It has a very two-tiered healthcare system. For the rich, it's world class, but particularly in rural India, it's really quite inadequate. And so they knew that if this got out of control, it was going to crash the healthcare system in a very big way. So they made the decision they did. As often with Prime Minister Modi, he takes decisions, but then takes them, there's a kind of weird impulsiveness. So he gave the country, 1.4 billion people 4 hours from 8 p.m. to midnight to prepare. And this is a country in which you have 50 to 60 million migrant workers who are working in cities but live hours and hours away. This is a country in which, as you say, most businesses conducted face to face. It seems like you could have given people, I would have said, give them 5 days or 3 days to prepare for this. But at the end of the day, I think I understand the decision Prime Minister Modi made. It is an attempt to say, look, we're going to suppress this as much as we can, keep the numbers very low. And then when we open up, we have the opportunity to do some of this testing and tracing. I hope they're using these 3 weeks to really ramp up mass testing. Because if you're not, this is what the United States did we put the ban on China, which was the right thing to do, ban on travel from China. But then we didn't take advantage of those 3 weeks to do anything.
What's your diagnosis of why the US didn't do that?
It's easy to blame Trump, and clearly this played to Trump's weaknesses. He doesn't believe in experts. He doesn't believe in science. He's impulsive. All he cares about is the stock market, and he worried that this would in some way interfere with its rise. He doesn't like bad news. He pushes it away. But, it's worth noting that even Dr. Anthony Fauci gave interviews in which he said this is not really likely to be a concern for the United States. So I think the way I would describe it is I think what happened is initially people looked at what happened in China and they thought because of what the Chinese had done, it would stay contained in China with a little bit of leakage. What they didn't realize was maybe that the Chinese had allowed more international travel, or they had locked down on domestic travel. And so they were sort of underreacting a little bit to what was the real nature of the problem. When it then came to Italy, Italy was the pivotal moment, I think, when it explodes in Italy. And that's when everyone starts panicking. And you could even argue that maybe there was a slight overreaction. And that's why you started seeing models that said 2 to 3 million people would die because people started using the Italian data, which I think is very complicated because Italians are your second oldest population in the world, very high incidence of smoking, very close intermingling, intergenerational living, and it may not be representative, but I think that's what happened.
Fareed, talk about just the partisan divide in so many countries and how you see this virus impacting that. I mean, you yourself, you work from CNN. It's regarded on the right as hopelessly liberal. You've been criticized by people on the right. You just criticized Trump right now, and so you're right in the middle of this constant firestorm of partisan battering. Is there? And yet you also spoke about some key things that the administration may have got right here in terms of, or at least in partnership with Congress, got right in terms of the stimulus that's actually been greater than in other countries. Do you see, coming away from the actual policy bit for a minute, but just us talking with each other, talking with people around the country and around the world, is there any way that this moment somehow reduces the partisan divide, or is it actually just ramping it up to ever more intense levels of, like, the people who are disgusted by Trump and what he's done are probably more disgusted and angry now than they have ever been. And maybe the people who are discussed it at Trump feel more strongly than ever. Is there any end to this, or are we just in for, I don't know, in the US, for example, the bloodiest election of all time and just an impossibly painful aftermath? Can there be any kind of path to both national unity and then, international connection out of this? I'm asking on behalf of a friend, many friends.
I wish I could give you much solace, but it's been striking, hasn't it, that if you look at this last month and a half, what is most striking is how little Donald Trump's approval ratings have moved. So if you look at, other periods in these kind of national crises, what tends to happen is the president's approval ratings go way up. George H.W. Bush after the fall of the Berlin Wall, George W. Bush after 9/11, even Jimmy Carter, in the first months of the hostage crisis, when the Iranians took American hostages, his numbers went up because there's a rally around the flag. It did happen for Trump for something like 10 days. And he's now back to approval ratings, which are roughly the same as where they were before. So in other words, what is striking about Donald Trump's approval ratings as a symbol for the partisan divide is how little they have moved one way or the other. So it's that his supporters support him no matter what. It's his opponents dislike him no matter what. And you're right, it's very hard to bridge those divides. Look, I try very hard to approach things from an analytic rather than a kind of polemical or partisan perspective. So as you say, when the administration does something right, I try to give them credit for it. I will point out, I get pilloried on both sides, by the way. The right doesn't accept the credit, and the left accuses me of being a traitor. But my view is, I'm a journalist. I'm trying to be not objective. No one is objective, but I'm trying to be analytic, and that's my job. So, for example, I'll give you one example. I've been looking a lot at the testing data, and it does appear that we have very bad data, that we really need to get much better testing data, and that the initial new data that we are getting, that on the basis of the more and more data we're getting, it does look like the fatality rates are much lower than we thought. In other words, that this disease might not be as fatal. And what I find is when I talk to people, everyone's trying to figure out in their heads, does that mean that, is this good for Trump? Is this bad for Trump? Is this where should I position myself on this? And my feeling is this is just a factual matter. And more importantly, we need to have the best data. We need to know what the actual fatality rate is, whatever the mistakes people made in the past, whatever the models did. But it's very difficult to even take something like data and completely unhinge it from the partisan context in which everything is now viewed. And that is part of a much larger discussion about how we have entered a realm of really tribal identity politics, where our political views reflect something very deep about our identity, and therefore very hard to change. They reflect who we are socioeconomically, they reflect who we are culturally, they reflect who we are in terms of our friend circle, where we live. So it's, mere data is not going to change that.
Do you take any solace from the fact that scientists are gaining in credibility? And is it possible to imagine that in the coming years that people will actually pay more attention when scientists tell us that there's something big and bad coming, we ought to pay attention to it?
I would hope so. I mean, I hope it makes us realize that in general, we all, I remember Michael Gove, the British minister, one of Boris Johnson's associates, saying during the Brexit campaign, the British public has had enough with experts. And I remember thinking at the time, when Michael Gove gets ill, I'm assuming he goes to a doctor. He doesn't consult, some guru or something like that. He goes to somebody who's trained and has expertise in a field and knows how to evaluate data. And I think what we're realizing here is in that situations like this, with all the caveats and with all the complications, you need experts. You need to rely on them. And as you say, Chris, what I hope is that we have a slight, that it translates. That if you believe the science and you trust the scientists and you think the data is getting better on this issue, well, maybe when they talk about climate change, we should also be keeping in mind that the same thing is true. And again, that the data has been proving and reproving and confirming what they've been saying for 20 years now.
Indeed. Let's wrap up with another question or two from Whitney and our online audience.
Sure. The audience is very interested in what you're sharing here, Fareed. And there's one question that's really simple, which is just how do you see this changing the balance of power globally?
I think, again, so much depends on how short this process is and what it does. But I'll tell you, one of the first things that I've been seeing when I've talked to people around the world, when you read newspaper accounts of what is happening, everyone has been stunned at the degree of chaos in the United States and the degree to which the healthcare system has proven to be inadequate. We don't even know how many beds we have. We don't know how many ventilators we have. And that is, I think it's a serious blow to America's image, because people would think that the United States might not be, the most beneficent power. It may not, it may do things that they would regard as crazy, like invade Iraq. But they always thought the American economy was the best. The American technology was the best. And so most people assumed American healthcare would be great. I think what they saw was the crazy quilt patchwork of the American healthcare system, with federal, state, local authorities competing. People don't even have the right data. So that piece of American soft power, if you will, the example of American power, has taken a beating. The second and perhaps more important issue is that it's not so much what it does to American power, it's what it does to the idea of common interests and common objectives and common policies. So what has happened, as I mentioned, is everyone has retreated and is pursuing things from their narrow self-interest, whether it's the Italians, the Germans, the Chinese, the South Koreans, and of course the Americans. It is the greatest damage to the system is done by the Americans, because we have traditionally been the world's leaders, the organizers, and things like that. But everywhere you are seeing a fraying of that international order, a fraying of that sense of cooperation, a fraying of the idea that there are common objectives. The scientists, give them credit, are working together. The scientists have been sharing information, American scientists, Chinese scientists, and you hear this everywhere, European scientists. If only the politicians could mirror the scientists. To me, there's a kind of tragic irony here, which is this is a classically global challenge, right? We're all in it together. We face a common foe, and this is almost biblical in its nature. This would be the time to unite, because this is a virus that does not discriminate on the basis of national boundaries, on the basis of skin color, on the basis of wealth. We're all in it together, and therefore, if we pool our resources and we would try to get a vaccine, try to get a cure, try to time the openings and closings, the quarantines, the reopenings of travel, all that would happen much more effectively. It would be a win-win-win if we could see that this is a global challenge, and therefore it necessitates a great global response. But at the same time, because of the nature of this challenge, because it involves our health, our security, perhaps, we've become very narrow-minded and drawn in. I'm hoping that after the initial shock goes away, people will realize that there really are such enormous benefits here to cooperating, to doing this together, to working with other countries, and that at the end of the day, what we're all looking for is health, safety, security. I'm an optimist, so I do hope that at some point it reawakens this sense that, think about the United States. We spend $700 billion on defense every year, and we don't have enough face masks for our healthcare workers. We don't have enough ventilators for our critically ill. Somewhere in there, we have got to rethink our priorities.
Well, indeed. In some ways, it's very simple. It's about math. It's about science. It's about a common enemy. When you have a common enemy, you kind of have to unite against it. And I still, the optimist in me is holding on to that possibility as well, that eventually we'll come around to that. Okay, that's a wrap for this episode. And as I mentioned earlier, we're now taking a 2-week break from these essentially daily live recorded podcasts about the coronavirus. Next week, we're posting a wonderful episode recorded with Professor Elizabeth Dunn, talking about the psychology of happiness and especially how it relates to generosity. So I recommend looking out for that. This week's show was produced by TED's indomitable media team, virtually situated around New York at this moment. And our mix engineer is David Herman. Our theme music is by Alison Leighton Brown. So once again, for feedback, write to us at podcasts@ted.com. Hey, thank you so much for listening. Stay safe.